Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of our keynotes for CNS Summit 2020. I'm particularly excited today to have Kabir with me, who is the CEO of Otsuka, and we've known each other for a while. And Otsuka has obviously been a big part of CNS Summit from the very beginning. And I'm quite excited to really speak with Kabir about where we're at Otsuka industry in general, what the future may look like. Now, in our conversations, Kabir, I know that both of us are the product of English boarding school, so we probably both have the scars from that. Tell me about your background and how you got to the US and where you are today leading Otsuka.
No, thanks, Amir, for that. Yeah, you're right. I can safely say that 20 years ago, I wouldn't have predicted that I would end up running the US subsidiary of a Japanese pharmaceutical company and living in New Jersey. But I've been very lucky. I built my career through a well-known company called Smith & Nephew, a medical technology company in the UK. From there, I moved to Bristol Myers Squibb. And as you know, the great thing about working for those big companies is they give you these opportunities to move around the world, acquire skills. So I've been lucky enough to work across Asia, including China, including Singapore. Came to the US with Bristol about 11 years ago and have built my career since then. So, have this probably bias towards international, multicultural opportunities, but I actually do think it makes you a better leader when you're able to adapt and observe and work across different cultures.
So I totally agree with that. So what do you think, having that global experience, how has that influenced your leadership style?
So in a number of ways, I think working in China was in many ways a formative experience. I didn't speak the language when I started, and I still didn't speak the language when I finished. But I think working in a different language, having to use interpreters and so on, forces a kind of concision in your language, a discipline in your thinking as well, that is really important. But I think most of all, it's at a time when we're all rightly focused on diversity, inclusion, and equity. It's a recognition that it truly takes people of all different backgrounds, experiences, upbringings to come together, to work together. And that, for me, is a personal passion and something that we try to live at Otsuka as well.
Thank you. Great. I definitely do agree that having to really think through how different cultures influence, interactions management really makes us kind of be aware of those issues and think about those diverse sort of needs of people, right? So Otsuka has been a leader in mental health for many years. And many other companies have left the space maybe a decade ago. I think there's a big comeback right now. What made Otsuka keep that commitment, and is that going to continue?
So it starts in our case from the fact that sadly there is still huge unmet need in the field of serious mental illness. While I'm very proud of Abilify and Rexulti and Abilify Maintena, and there have been other great drugs in this area. The fact is we still unfortunately do not do a great job of getting to really good outcomes for patients living with serious mental illness. So for Otsuka, having discovered aripiprazole, having made that into an important medication, the commitment now is really ingrained in the company all the way from research through development, through commercial and so on. And we're simply not going to give up because we know there are really hard problems still to solve. I think, as you said, what's interesting now is that people are coming back in, and I'm sure we'll go on to talk more about some of the interesting new ideas that are emerging. But really, it's a commitment for us. And each time we talk seriously about what is our purpose, what are we trying to do as a company, we actually come back to that focus on mental health and serious mental illness. And that is at the core of what we do.
And I'm aware of lots of initiatives that may not be even traditional that you've been doing in terms of mental health. Can you give some examples of that so everyone knows about it?
So certainly, one is in the digital space, and we'll go on to talk more about that. But I think in an area where, as we know, unfortunately in psychiatry, there are really no physiological biomarkers, there are really no objective endpoints. We've thought for a long time that digital therapeutics have the potential to actually treat some of the symptoms of mental illness. In the area of behavioral health, we think that digital therapeutics have their biggest short-term potential. So that's an area we've invested in. We look also at digital biomarkers and sensors. We can talk more about the digital medicine that we co-developed with Proteus. Yeah. But I think also there are other areas where the science is starting to take us as well, which are interesting to look at.
And what about, I know of some initiatives you've done with PBS and the foundation at Otsuka. Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yes, because we, as part of our commitment to being in this area, recognize that, particularly in the field of serious mental illness, the drug or the medication is frankly only a very, very small part of the patient's journey. So we have always believed that it's important that we actually engage and are active much more broadly. And I think in the last couple of years, we've actually stepped up on that. So there is an initiative, there's the Wellbeings Initiative working with PBS, which is hosting a series now of virtual events in cities around the country. And that's really focused on the youth mental health crisis and the fact that unfortunately that youth mental health crisis is continuing to get worse. We also established last year a foundation, the Sozose Foundation, which is chaired by Dr. Bill Carson, who I know is known to many of the attendees here. And under Bill's leadership, we're doing a number of things, but one of them is a very significant effort in the area of criminal justice or the decriminalization of mental health in the criminal justice system. Because sadly in the US, that's a huge issue and one that people are starting to tackle piecemeal. And we see a real opportunity really to convene a number of people together to talk about that and really to start to replicate best practice in different places around that. So those are two examples kind of outside the mainstream of driving for new medications or new treatments.
Yeah, and I think that both those clearly are very important areas. So I'm really happy to hear you're doing that. I also know that this year you made an investment in Compass Pathways, whose founders we had on the CNS Summit stage last year. What does that investment from Otsuka really mean for validation of the psychedelic approach in mental health?
So I think, and George and Katya would probably answer that question better from their perspective as what they think, but I think from our perspective, to take a step back, I mean, we, as I said, we recognize there is an urgent need for new treatments for serious mental illness. And there are starting to be some other novel MOAs and so on that are interesting. But about a couple of years ago, we had a team and it was, people work really well together. So an informal team of experts and folks from all across the organization got together to really consider what was happening in the field of psychedelics and what the opportunities could be. And they came back to me and other senior leadership with a very clear recommendation that now was the time to start engaging in that space, with a clear belief that it's possible, at least, that the first psychedelics could be approved in the next few years for areas such as treatment-resistant depression. As part of that, of course, Compass was already a leading company in the field, so we started to get into dialogue with Compass last year, and I think we were able to build a strong relationship with them. And I'm thrilled that we were able to invest in the Series B. As you know, they've since had an IPO, which has been very successful. And we're hopeful and delighted to see their continuing progress in developing psilocybin as a treatment.
That's great. Now, I know that personally you have a commitment to mental health yourself. Can you talk about that, please?
Yes, I think, well, first, I actually think almost all of us actually have a close connection to areas of serious mental illness, whether it's family, friends, or colleagues. And in my case, at a relatively young age, so one of my closest friends from school died by suicide at the beginning of our second term at university. And at the age of 19, really nothing about that. And this is, this a long time ago, more than 30 years ago, and really none of us had the language to talk about it. A few years later, my father also died by suicide, and I was 23 at the time. And again, for me, that was clearly a time of really not having any answers and having questions that, I continue to have over 30 years later. But I've known, therefore, the impact that untreated mental illness can have on families, on friends, and so on. And for me, that's part of a personal passion. And what I found, and I hadn't shared those stories for a long time, because they are very personal and it takes time. But what I found once I started to do so a few years ago is just how many other people have similar stories and how much they resonate.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I really appreciate you sharing that today. Let's change subjects around from psychiatry, mental health, and Otsuka's kind of long history there and what you described as the future. Let's talk about digital medicine, already an area that Otsuka was really at the cutting edge of really, again, investing there. And you recently acquired the Proteus assets. Can you tell me what lessons as an organization yourself you learned through that, and what you think digital medicine looks like for both Otsuka and beyond for the whole industry?
Thanks. It's a great question. So where we started, as we started to work with Proteus, remains an area of fundamental importance, which is the area of non-adherence. So we know that for chronic conditions, the vast majority of patients do not take their medicines on a consistent basis, and certainly not over a long time. And we also know that depending on the particular illness that's being treated, that can have more or less serious consequences. And right from the start, we acknowledge that in the area of serious mental illness, that can have potentially very serious consequences in terms of emergency room admission, rehospitalization, subsequent episodes. So the premise for working with Proteus remains absolutely core, which is we believed and continue to believe that there is a technology here which in its ability to measure ingestion can actually help caregivers, physicians, the patient themselves to actually be in better control of their medication and therefore their disease. We also had to recognize that implementing a complex technology in this very complicated healthcare ecosystem that exists, particularly in this country, is really, really hard. So, I mean, maybe it shouldn't have taken us that to learn that lesson, but I think everyone, and this is a common theme as people work on digital solutions, digital technologies, the process of getting adoption, ensuring that not just from the patient perspective, but they fit into the physician workflow, they fit into the payer's environment and so on, is hard. And we will continue to struggle with elements of that, I know. We, though, as you said, we continue to see significant promise in that. We continue to recognize that we need to build the evidence first. We need to build the evidence disease by disease. We have to demonstrate the value. But ultimately, there could be a tipping point where you move beyond that individual patient basis to actually providing information at scale, data at scale, and you can get into a different type of relationship potentially with payers. But we know we have to take a number of steps on the way. We're very committed to doing that. We are going to continue to invest in that. And we're going to continue to reflect on the lessons we've learned, among them being that, pharmaceutical companies do not move at the speed of software companies. And ultimately, though, for us to be successful in this space, we're going to have to learn to adapt, and we're going to have to learn new ways of working within pharma.
So I think in our previous conversations, I've talked about how it's not surprising the first wave of digital therapeutics with the challenges within the ecosystem you said would have a hard time, right? Really integrating. And I think it's called the bleeding edge for a reason, right? You do tend to bleed sometimes. I personally am very bullish about digital kind of in the long term. Would you agree with that?
I am, because I think a couple of things. I think one of the lessons we already knew, but the last 7 months have reminded us, is that increasingly we need to meet patients where they are. And the ubiquity of whether it's mobile phones or other devices and so on, and the fact that not every patient, but many patients are keen to use those. So as vehicles for improving their health and so on. So that ability to meet patients where they are, I think, is fundamental. I think the second, which also was clearly already an accelerating trend, is that we, the industry, are going to be much less able to rely on face-to-face interactions with providers and others. I mean, I think there are, parts of the world where, frankly, maybe not so much in the US, but there are parts of the world where I think it's going to be difficult in future to get much face-to-face access with prescribers, with healthcare physicians. So again, we're going to have to find new tools and technologies and so on that work there. But I think, as I said earlier, particularly in the area of behavioral health, we strongly believe that digital therapeutics can actually be part of treatment.
Yeah. So it's interesting you've broadened the conversation around digital engaging really with patients, with prescribers, providers, and all your customers basically. So has the pandemic given you sort of new insights into how you need to engage with them going forward?
Yes, absolutely. So no surprise, psychiatry already had a stronger base in telehealth than almost any other specialty, and pivoted more rapidly towards telehealth than any other specialty. Some of it's come back, but some of it will be sticky. So some insights from there. But again, a reminder of the complexity, because we're already now starting to hear that payers are no longer willing to pay for telehealth, that some of what we thought might be, catalysts for a real change unfortunately are still going the wrong way. But yes, it clearly has around that. But even in other areas, like our other core business is in kidney disease and our treatment for polycystic kidney disease, which has a complex REMS. And what we heard back was that both patients and physicians were saying that unless they had a face-to-face discussion between each other, they were not willing to start therapy. I recognize that, and I could imagine myself in that same situation. But clearly, we need to find ways through virtual engagement, through new tools, through ways that actually make it possible for that sort of patient initiation, for that sort of start of treatment to happen, even in a virtual context. Because so we're listening to our patients, listening to our customers, our providers, prescribers, and really trying to understand, okay, what can we do? And then it comes back to digital, because clearly there are ways of synthesizing information, providing information to the patient and the provider and the broader range of the office where and how they need it, not just when we feel like providing it, which has been the industry's traditional way to operate.
That's great. Now, we've talked about the use and the sort of the impact of digital on the various stakeholders you've already mentioned. Let me finish by asking you about maybe employees and the future of work. Obviously, I think pharma in particular used to be extremely centralized. Everyone had to be in the same offices. What do you think about the future of work and remote as an option for employees?
So it's clearly going to look different. I think the idea that any of us need to spend 12 hours a day, 5 days a week in one office will seem kind of quaint when we look back on this time. I think part of the challenge, of course, is when we've done it as many employers have done. When you ask people right now, of course they're saying, I don't want to spend time in the office because it's not safe. And I think, I keep on reminding people we shouldn't talk about a post-pandemic world. We should talk about a world where we are living with this disease at a contained level.
Yes.
I think there will clearly be a much more flexible mix. I mean, I think we've heard loud and clear that people want much more freedom and flexibility in terms of how they operate. And I think, already we're based, as you know, in New Jersey, and already whether somebody's in New Jersey or in Boston or Cambridge or maybe further down the East Coast, that no longer seems like a big deal. And so the idea that people will come together for certain meetings and so on and not spend all that time. So I think it will change. I think the harder one for us as a Japanese company has been the inability to travel to Japan. And that, I think, so while I think a lot of business travel will probably come down and ease off, I think traveling to Asia, once we are able to do that, we'll probably be doing just as much, because that relationship building and frankly, the time zones are going to require it.
Great. So to finish up, is there anything that's surprised you or that you've been thinking about while you've been at home during the pandemic? Has there any insights come to you being stuck at home?
So certainly, and I'm sure you've heard many leaders say this, it's made me much more human to my colleagues. And I think that's really important. So, in the same way as you're all seeing me at home with a painting behind me, so they have done. So I think that's one really important thing. And it's reminded me again of some of those core leadership lessons that we tend to forget when everything is going well, which is that being vulnerable, acknowledging that you don't have the answers, but creating a sense of confidence and a sense of momentum that we're going to get through this are so fundamentally important.
So talking of this, I really love that and appreciate you saying that. Talking of the painting behind you, I know that your team looks forward to seeing the different artwork all the time in your Zooms. Can you just tell us who the artist is, just in case people are interested in that particular painting?
I can. This is an artist called Leonard Newman from Philadelphia, who I think flourished shortly after the Second World War in the 50s and 60s. He was a part of the abstract expressionist group and then returned to Philly, and this is kind of his signature style.
That's fantastic. It's interesting to me how many leaders in our world are actually artists or connoisseurs, so it's fantastic to sort of hear that, and I'm sure they'll be interested. Kabir, I really appreciate you taking time to talk with us. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Please, next year, I'm hoping you will be there in person. Many people want to come and chat to you in person, so we welcome you to do that. And during the summit, there'll be receptions that we hope you can be at so people can interact with you directly.
Amir, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure. And I know there are a few other Otsuka people who are also participating this year, and we're delighted to continue our support. So thank you.
Thank you.